To be here in this dialogue between UNAM Chicago and the Center for Research in North America. This is called Diálogos del Bicentenario, of diplomatic relationships between Mexico and the United States. We have here Dr. Peter Krieger, of UNAM, of the Research Institute of Aesthetic Arts, and Dr. Dietrich Neumann from Brown University. I will read each of their bios very quickly so that we all know them. Dr. Peter Krieger is PhD in art history of University of Hamburg in Germany. Since 1998, he's a research professor at the University of Aesthetic Research, Instituto, Investigaciones, Estéticas at UNAM, and a professor of art history and architecture at National Autonomous University of Mexico. From 2004 to 2012, he's vice president of the International Committee of Art History and a fellow at research project Transcultural and Transhistoric Efficiencies of the Baroque Paradigm at the University of Western Ontario in London, Canada. He is a member of the Commission of Billboards at the Ministry of Urban Development, and in 2016, Abby Warburg Professorship at the Warburg House, Hamburg University in Germany. In 2017, he's a visiting fellow, Cultures of the Global South at Tübingen University, and visiting professor at Regensburg University. One of the principal investigators of the SNF Synergia project, mediating the ecological imperative in Bern, Switzerland. His research work and publications encompass the history, aesthetics, and political iconography of architecture, cities, and landscapes in the 20th and 21st centuries. Dr. Dietrich Neumann is a professor of history and art and architecture, director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage, professor of Italian Studies. He's a professor of the history of modern architecture and director of urban studies at Brown University. He was trained as an architect in Munich, Germany, and at the Architectural Association in London, and received his PhD from Munich University. His publications have dealt with the history of skyscrapers, movie set design, architectural illumination, building materials, and in particular with the work of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. He has won fellowships at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, at the American Academies in Berlin and Rome, and won the Founders in 1996 at Philip Johnson Awards from the Society of Architectural Historians, where he served as a president from 2008 to 2010 and was named a fellow in 2018. He was a first Vincent Scully visiting professor at Yale School of Architecture and is member of the Committee on Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art. My name is Jimena Torre. I'm an architect and professor at UNAM School of Architecture, and I will be moderating this dialogue. Welcome to both of you.
Hello.
Thank you. I think I'm a colleague for many, many years, Peter Krieger, for inviting me, also Professor Fonserrada, and of course, Professor Jimena Torre, who is going to lead us through this discussion. I will share my screen now and begin right away. I want to talk a little bit about New York City, as we had discussed. I know Professor Krieger will talk about Mexico City and others, and we'll mostly talk about New York City today, but also a very brief history at the very beginning. As many of you know, in the history of the skyscraper, New York City holds a special place. It held, in fact, the position of hosting in a way the tallest tower for a record number of 43 years. It started with the Singer Building in 1908, then followed by the Metropolitan Life Tower in 1909, and then finally the Woolworth Building in 1913, which held the title until 1930. Then in quick sequence, there was 40 Wall Street, the Chrysler Building, and then the Empire State Building, which held the title again for a record-setting 40 years from 31 to 71, then followed by the World Trade Center. And then the title of having the tallest tower in the world went over to Chicago, where Professor Fonserrada is right now, and the Sears Tower, now called Willis Tower, took over and again held that title for a long time. And then finally, it went abroad to Kuala Lumpur with the Petronas Towers, Taipei 101 in 2004, and finally the Burj Khalifa that still holds it to this very day. If we look at statistics here, it's really quite interesting to see the enormous length of time that New York City dominated that field and the number of different buildings. And also we can see how, in fact, the sort of increase in height sped up in recent years with Burj Khalifa. But I wanted to just briefly mention there are other reasons why New York City holds such a special place in the history of the skyscraper. More than any other place in the world, partially due to being a pioneer, it really shaped the form of the skyscraper, created a theoretical discussion about it. And I'm thinking, of course, of the famous setback law of 1916 that came with a zoning ordinance so that it suggested to step back the floors above a corner side under an angle that depended on the width of the street and the zone of the city, illustrated here beautifully by Hugh Ferris in 1922, or another one of those landmark moments in 1961 when a new building code responded to the Seagram building's plaza in front and allowed that as a way of building skyscrapers. And out of this grew something really quite wonderful, the privately owned public spaces. It's called POPs, P-O-P-S, where in fact you can provide a publicly accessible space in return for more height of your building elsewhere. And of course, the sale of air rights above a building that is either not needed or above rail lines, etc., also played into this sort of negotiation that developers routinely do with the building authorities. But I want to jump right in and talk about a few projects that are interesting today. And in fact, I want to begin with Hudson Yards, which has been the largest private public development in American history, was finished just before the pandemic struck. And the area had long been looked at by eager developers and the city at first for the Olympic Games, and then in fact as a development opportunity since the air rights over those railroad lines that you can see here were available. The whole project was meant to be instant urbanism, providing housing, work, shopping, restaurants, entertainment, all in close vicinity. Top architects were hired such as Norman Foster, Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. Frank Gehry is building a tower there, and the building went ahead. As I said, it was the largest mixed-use private real estate venture in American history. And the towers are grouped, clustered around a shopping mall. The interior there is by Ercus Manfredi. There's Norman Foster with one of the towers. There's Cohn, Peters, and Fox. And there is David Childs and Skidmore and Merrill. David Ross, in fact, the developer, is a sort of businessman with his related companies. He has developed other properties in New York. He also owns the Miami Dolphins and a number of other ventures. And here is Cohn, Peters, and Fox Tower with that edge, the viewing platform at the very top, which is sort of one of the draws to bring people to this area. But perhaps most, and you see here, the idea, in fact, of providing sort of urban excitement and entertainment in this neighborhood. And then, of course, there's also a sleek and cylindrical tower by Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, who had the great idea of turning an old rail line into a horizontal linear park, the so-called High Line, which actually now connects to Hudson Yards. And they built one of the towers and added the public amenity of a flexible theater that can respond to different audience sizes by actually having enormous wheels and moving in and out there. And you see it here. Another last amenity to mention is the so-called vessel by the British designer Thomas Heatherwick, with 154 intricately interconnected flights of stairs, 2,500 steps, and 80 landings. It all opened to great fanfare in 2019, but timing could not have been worse for this development as COVID came shortly afterwards. Visitors numbers plummeted. Sadly, several suicides at the vessel led to its closure, and major store brands have left. Many critics felt that Hudson Yard was not only atypical for New York City and would mostly attract tourists and newcomers, but it would also take economic power and incentives away from other parts of the cities. And then economists weighed in particular Bridget Fisher and Flavia Leite, in a very long report that's online for the New School of Social Research and its Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis. This report was picked up by the intrepid critic of the New York Times, a man called Michael Kimmelman, who in fact reminded his readers of a recent debate when Amazon, the retailer, had offered the city to move one of its headquarters to Queens, create 25,000 jobs there, and asked for $3 billion tax break in return. It was eventually turned down, but with far less public attention, the city government has for more than a decade funneling even more money into the development of Hudson Yards. The tax breaks and other government assistance, in fact, amount to almost $6 billion. All of this in Kimmelman's wonderful article, and he describes how the city paid for the subway line, the number 7 subway line to Hudson Yards, created acres of parks to make it more attractive, paid for it out of taxpayer money. Then there is interest payments that the city took over when the project didn't create enough income in the beginning. And so almost 90% of the office tenants there are transfers from Midtown, lured by lucrative tax breaks provided by New York politicians to the developers. So companies moved from Midtown and moved over.
Has brought us what Rem Koolhaas called junk space, a generic city. Here another photograph of Santa Fe, and also it expresses a notion which already is included in the film, the fantastic film of Fritz Lang, Metropolis, that the high-rise buildings also symbol of social segregation in this case in Mexico City, a highly segregated city. Also, what we can find are problems that for reasons of corruption and so on, many projects of the real estate market, which are project in short terms, they want to earn the money in the most rapid way, so are built without geophysical investigations. And then you have such situations that the nature strikes back and questions this product of human civilization. And we have also these types of hyper developments, as Dietrich has shown us with the Hudson project. And this is the Torre Mythica, a group of international renewed architects implanted this project. And here on the render, you can see the fascination of the illuminated towers, and also what Dietrich has shown us. It's a fascination, but of course, the effect is terrible for all the neighborhood. It produces a big, severe damage of the social and spatial structure of this neighborhood. So I want to point out that skyscrapers are not sustainable. There's no green skyscraper. This is really not truth. And the context of this is that only 3% of the world is covered by cities, but they produce about 75% of the CO2 emissions. So architect Richard Rogers once said the city is a parasite. And we are living in times when the techno mass is heavier than the biomass. So these are paradigms, parameters of the Anthropocene which we're living in, and which we have to do with the architecture. For example, the production of architecture the production and destruction is responsible for about 50% of the pollution, of the air pollution. So we have this. We have the situation that the symbol of progress of modernism also is a dystopian symbol, became a dystopian symbol. And I want to finish this with an example which is close to my place where I live, in the Colonia Nápoles in Mexico City, where we have an open space which is still not under construction because of the speculation, real estate speculation. And there is growing now in the last 2 years vegetation. So I think we should rethink the production of skyscrapers and maybe sometimes just think and stop and leave open spaces in the city and apply what is called the sponge city, Ciudad Esponja. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krieger. Well, I think these two talks are very interesting in a way. I don't think there can be any more contrasting conditions for development of skyscrapers than New York and Mexico City. The first is the firm, very stable rock ground, while Mexico City is the bottom of a lake, of a dried lake, of an artificially dried up lake that has become some sort of a gelatin, yellow, and it moves as such a jello. So I will first will be asking you if Dr. Peter Krieger, if you have any questions or matters to ask Dr. Dietrich Neumann, and then Dr. Dietrich Neumann to respond and to ask, of course, something about Dr. Krieger's talk.
Yes, Dietrich, thank you very much for your talk. I was inspired to travel back to New York, which is a city which I like very much, of course. And I'm especially happy that you mentioned Rockefeller Center and the aspect of scenography. I mean, what you have in the Hudson project is kind of a scenography of the real estate market. So it's an accumulation of built meters and really, if you compare it directly, you see the scenographic qualities. And I mean, to build such a mass, a high-rise building is a responsibility for all the city. I mean, you as an architectural historian in your books, you have mentioned it, and I want to mention it here as well. There's another tradition of the high-rise building in the beginning of the 20th century, which is the crown of the city, Stadtkrone. So it's a responsibility once you build so much that this material and this design has to be good, has to be individual, just like a medieval cathedral and a Gothic cathedral. So, I mean, the early skyscrapers, they fulfill this. The people have this orientation. They know this is our Empire State Building, although it's, of course, it's a hyper-capitalist project, but it gives something to the city. And I think this is missing because the recent scenographies, the Hudson project, or also what I've shown in the meeting, are kind of exchangeable global aesthetics for a very few part of the people, of the population, which has the economic power to have a drink there or go shopping there. So I think this is kind of a perversion of this idea.
I completely agree. I quoted Michael Kimmelman, the critic of the New York Times, a little bit at length, and I completely agree with him and with what you just said, that the banality of the architecture at Hudson Yards is astonishing. That no one stepped in, no design committee, and said, you know, we need, if we're going to do this, we need interesting architecture. The towers all look exchangeable, and not just amongst themselves, but also they could be found pretty much in any city around the world. And that's why I contrasted it with what I think is more interesting, buildings that actually understand the particular history of New York City in the history of the skyscraper, and refer to setback, to luminous fins like Norman Foster in my last example. So I think there are reference points that that good architects sense and refer to, but not in cases like Hudson Yards, where the developer is driving the whole thing, and obviously things had to be done quickly and ended up being done without any sort of really characteristic expression, which is really a pity. I think one of the ideas was that perhaps the vessel, this big work of public art, would make this a characteristic space, but I think that also backfired in many different ways, both tragically as being, you know, obviously an attractive point for people who wanted to end their lives, but also as a work of public art that didn't really lead to a really sort of meaningful experience, and it took up too much space and destroyed a little bit of public space that was there in a way. So I think, you know, in some ways it's probably going to survive Hudson Yards, and will attract tourists and visitors to the city, but I don't think it's a great contribution to urban planning or to the city's character. I think the more recent buildings that I showed have a much stronger presence there and local connection.
I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned the design committees, because this is kind of a academic and also a political issue, because in many cases in New York, in Mexico City, in many big cities of the world, the urban development is in the hands of the real estate developers and not of the people. I mean, you have to live with this every day. So, I mean, there should be more mechanisms of a democratic relation, only give it to the hands of the developers. And this is also something important for us at the university. So we have to generate a reasonable critique of these projects, not to continue mistakes and these kind of mistakes. But of course, we sometimes are just like in an ivory tower, and outside the real business world is just pushing through these projects. So I think we have to deal with these mechanisms of intervention, of participation, of critique, and of expertise of design committees.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think an extension to that, as academics, we also have an obligation to not just stay in the ivory tower, but be vocal and try and help shape ideas about what our cities should and look like that even developers can embrace, because the existing committees are mostly toothless. If you have a developer who he has sort of a personal wealth of $7.7 billion, it's very hard to have a committee really put up a sort of meaningful resistance there. This is not exactly how the system functions, but I think there is also, he probably wouldn't mind being a little more educated about what it means to create good architecture. It would certainly help him with his brand and so on. And that sort of translation of what critics think and what developers do is not happening very easily. It happened in this case after the case. If he had read Michael Kimmelman's piece in the New York Times before, maybe he would have changed his mind and would have engaged more with the architects and created something more meaningful than what ultimately happened there.
I mean, there are good stories. I remember many years ago when I was in New York with it was Tony Tang, architect and author, showed me around, and he worked for many years in the Landmarks Preservation Commission in New York and in Manhattan. I mean, and he had some very hard struggles with the investment business, and he's succeeded in preserving many sites, or for example, an African slave burial ground in the midst of New York, which has a high value in economic terms, but they kept it. So, I mean, it's not only a negative story, and there are many people who are really try to get involved, but of course, confronting the power of billions of dollars, then it's not easy.
Yeah, no, I agree. There are also good stories. I shouldn't sound so negative. I think Hudson Yards, as far as I can see, didn't work out, which is too bad because it's such a huge investment. But I think we have other stories. I'm thinking of the attempt of making Penn Station more attractive, and the Moynihan Hall there in the old post office is a success story without a doubt. Penn Station is a good comparison because it also used the air rights above the train tracks when it sold the old building and had Madison Square Garden built. So a mechanism very similar to what happened at Hudson Yards, just 2 blocks down, right? So now we're trying to repair it, and there's other discussions underway what to do in this neighborhood. So definitely one shouldn't give up, but I think we definitely need more discourse that can lead to better architecture before it's being built, rather than afterwards when the whole thing stands and can't be changed anymore.
And I have another question. I mean, you live in Providence in Rhode Island, and do you think that these New York projects, New York, Chicago projects are exported? Because we have something similar here in Mexico. It's a difference. It's not fair to say this, but it's the reality for people that we are the center, Mexico City, and the other parts are the peripheral, rural parts, although there are big cities, Guadalajara, Monterrey. And then you see that these cities try to copy Mexico City. So they build elevated highways, which is quite anachronic, and they try to copy these big real investment projects. Just how is it in your city, Providence, where Brown?
Funny that you mentioned that. It's a really good comparison. We have a skyscraper. Providence is not a big city, right? Where we have a skyscraper downtown that was built in like 1926 or so, and Providence always wanted to be a bigger city than it really was. It had big metropolitan ambitions, so they adopted the New York City setback law, although there was absolutely no reason for them to do that because we don't have canyons of skyscrapers. Most buildings are 4 or 5 stories. But we got the setback law, and when they finally built a skyscraper, which is still sort of the visual center of the city, it stepped back very elegantly. It's actually a very nice looking building. We call it the Superman building because it looks a little bit like the Daily Planet newspaper building in the early Superman films. But they imported that notion of the setback from New York without needing it as a sign of sort of metropolitan aesthetics. And now currently we have a developer from Brooklyn who wants to build a 42-story tower that would be the tallest tower in Providence. And it brings he brings along a sort of more streamlined New York City aesthetic, or somewhat exchangeable. He has built in Toronto, and it looks a little bit like the Toronto waterfront, all those high rises there. So it's not exactly specific to Providence, which is one of the reasons why it has been held up by our design committees for quite some time, because people say, this is Providence, Rhode Island, and we are special. We have a local culture and local aesthetic, and it should respond to that. So these things happen all the time. It's really quite interesting. But I think he has taken all the hurdles that were put up, and I don't know if it's going to move forward, but it was exactly that transfer of ideas from a central metropolitan city to a small city, just like you described.
Yeah. You work in a design committee? I was
I'm unfortunate, obviously following to what I just said, right? We academics should be involved. I've been involved in the design committee at Brown and somewhat marginally in the city, but I should really be more involved. It's a very good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I worked many years in the committee of billboards in Mexico City, in the Secretary of Urban Development, and it was a very hard experience, I must say, that the businessmen came with the lawyers there, and so it's a big part. It's an illegal business, and it was not easy for me to be there, but a good experience. I liked it very much.
Well, that's fascinating, obviously, because it's probably parallel to being on the design review board, skyscraper designs and so on. That's absolutely fascinating. I'm glad you did that and you had an impact there.
Maybe Jimena, you want to make a comment or ask more questions?
Well, I was thinking that in Mexico City, the codes around building skyscrapers have evolved in relationship of earthquakes and what a building has to resist, right? And also lately they have been changing in order to accumulate less cars, because in Mexico City, very differently as in New York, buildings have to allow a lot of space of parking for cars. So again, it's very different for New York City. What would you say, Dr. Dietrich Neumann, would be the elements of the codes, the evolving of the codes in New York City?
Well, I think the key steps, apart from the setback that I mentioned, right, was the idea of trading public spaces and offering public spaces in return for taller, higher numbers of floors elsewhere, which is a very much a sort of New York City phenomenon, and driven, I think, by a good idea of having, publicly accessible but private spaces that developers provide. Some work really well, like the plaza in front of the Seagram building is much used by people at the lunch hour and so on. Others, are mostly deserted because they don't get any sunlight and no one really spends much time there. But the idea of forcing developers to do something for the common good, for the public, is a good one, and that drove that idea. So there are some good ideas that other cities can, I think, learn from and adopt. But as Peter pointed out, it's worth remembering that New York City, and you pointed that also out, Jimena, that of course, sitting on a granite ledge, you can build very tall. You don't have to worry about earthquakes. And of course, you have an island, which means you're very limited in space. Mexico City is quite different. The reasoning for skyscrapers is not always as pressing, perhaps, as it is in New York City. And so, and maybe as a last point, the swaying that comes with earthquakes in Mexico City, as I pointed out, is something that we now have with these super slim skyscrapers as well. And they haven't managed to figure out how to avoid the negative effects of that. So there's a lot of slightly surreal and illogical developments. But I wanted to come back to Peter, if I may, since you said I could ask him also a question. I was very interested in your point, which I always also make to my class, the sort of fact that 50% of the sort of carbon footprint and environmental impact of what we do comes from building buildings, making cities, transportation, destroying buildings, whatever, anything, making concrete, and all of this together that creates the urban environment is a major factor in the sort of climate crisis that we're in, and the ecological crisis. And the question is, what are the ways out? You showed that very intriguing and strange looking example of the Torre Reforma, which looked as if, as you pointed out, looks as if things had fallen off during an earthquake, which was just sort of an illustration, but it also looked as if it had almost no windows. And I wonder if you see sort of meaningful responses in this field that take this equation of 50% of what we do is sort of harmful to, and it contributes directly to the climate crisis. If you see that in buildings applied meaningfully towards better results.
It's an interesting case, this tower. Of course, there's a machinery of propaganda around this tower, and it's very famous worldwide now. And I mean, it has other parts with more glass facades. And so this is just one facade. I may send you some images of the tower. It's also a striking contradiction that they built it on a historical building of the late 19th century, so which they had to move. But I mean, behind this is this tower has a kind of a contradictory semantics. And in Spanish it would call it autogol. I don't know how to say this in English. It's you meet your own goal, and so it's quite absurd if you go into the details. I wrote an article on this, and but behind this is the debates on the architecture in the Anthropocene. If you just see how much Earth is removed, and to build such a tower with this stability, with this height, which you have to move so much Earth. So this is a typical example of how the Anthropocene is the new geological era, not officially approved, but it is a debate which began by Paul Crutzen, then philosophers as Bruno Latour got into it. So you can trace the human power. The human power is kind of a geological force, and that's I think the big issue in this building project. So it's the typical aspect. We do not have many alternatives. Of course, there are some experiments in Germany recently to build a high-rise building with wood. But of course, there are many problems also. If the wood is not sustainable, it comes from Indonesia or whatever, then you have also a negative environmental balance. But there are interesting things, or you may remember also when you were in Munich, Thomas Herzog, and he's tried to avoid air conditions. So I mean, we cannot avoid the human trace on Earth. So we want to live in cities, we want to construct, we want to have office buildings, but we can try to reduce. And this is what's happening in Torre Reforma. It's excessive. It's just the accumulation of space, rentable space, to make a lot of money, and then give it a kind of a signature, which is quite contradictory. But I mean, I'm working with my architecture students on these issues. So of course we use concrete, we use aluminum, but we have to know what's the environmental balance, what's the footprint of the production of aluminum, of concrete, and so on. There are also new researches going on concrete with less environmental impact. So we have to get updated and have the consciousness to when we use this material. Not only it's very beautiful, just like in the announcements of the concrete industry, where everything is wonderful. Of course, concrete is a very good material, very practical, but it has a very negative environmental balance.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And of course, I'm thinking of, the sort of awareness of climate and in a way, a sort of lack of response to local conditions when you think of the tallest skyscraper, be it the Burj Khalifa or be it the skyscraper in Saudi Arabia that was meant to be the world's tallest, which got stuck because of internal political unrest and economic issues who came along with it, at a height of like 57 stories, and it sits in the middle of the desert as an unfinished building. And that might be the end of the super tall skyscraper as we know it. But we will have to see if that fascination endures, given what you just pointed out, Peter, that there's a rising awareness of our impact on the Earth's surface and the impact on all our building on the climate change. And that might put an end to this. We can only speculate. People had predicted the end of the skyscraper after 9/11. I remember reading about this, and didn't take long before the movement got up and going again, and more tall towers were built. But I think there's a hope that maybe Burj Khalifa was the last one of the super tall towers. But given what happened in New York and is happening currently with the world's tallest residential towers, there's still fascination that comes along with that. So it's a whole Freudian topic to explore. What makes that fascination so enduring?
Well, it's the fascination, the seduction of the rendering. And I could imagine sitting there with a wonderful view on Central Park. It's wonderful, but then with the noise of the garbage thrown down, it's not so nice. So of course, as we work with visual material and art history, architecture history, you know this. You did a wonderful book on the light and the illustrations, or the architecture in film. We have to have this critical view, or present this critical view. What's the difference between the constructed material and the visual construction in announcements or in films? So that's important.
Exactly, yeah, especially in New York City, right? That's a big part of, I think, what makes the city attractive. This sort of imagery that has been created over the last 100 years in movies and images and postcards and whatnot, and to strengthen and continue that image is certainly in the interest of the city that wants to attract tourists and visitors and businesses too. It's very important.
Well, Jimena, I don't know how we are with the time frame. Maybe it's time to conclude, or do you have another question?
Well, I have a lot of questions because I think there have been many things that are really interesting that have been said. I don't know if it's okay with you. I would like to ask two questions to Dr. Neumann to tell us more about this relationship between height versus scale. And Dr. Krieger, you said a phrase that I think it's really interesting, and I've heard a lot, is nature strikes back and questions things. So if you could both tell me more about this very shortly, because I think we're already approaching to the end.
Just very quickly, I think one of the points that was made in this quite brilliant piece in the New York Times criticizing Hudson Yards, comparing it with Rockefeller Center, was that the common good should be something that we have in mind when we build these huge developments. And he pointed out that some of those super slim skyscrapers that have recently been built have no public areas at the top. They're just there for the people who spend a lot of money on having these apartments. And of course, they rise rather abruptly from the streetscape, whereas in Rockefeller Center, you had a very careful orchestration of lower buildings to mid-sized buildings, and then to the big RCA tower in the center by Raymond Hood. And these were qualities of urban design that he felt were lost both at Hudson Yards and with those slim towers, and should be brought back. And that is really making sure that the common good and what helps the pedestrians and the people who come to New York and visit helps them to engage with the city in a meaningful way, rather than just having the developer and the billionaire owners in mind who enjoy their view from there. So that was, I think, the idea. It's very important.
Well, the notion, the nature strikes back, is coming from Horacio, the ancient poet, and he talked about the revenge of the nature. So this is a quite an established topic. And what I'd like to say is that in the strict sense, there's no natural catastrophes. You know, we have many images of flooded cities, of earthquakes, and so on. So it's not the problem of nature. It's our problem. We as human beings construct on sites which would not appropriate. I mean, if you build a high-rise building on a former lake ground, then you are producing a problem, and then you're almost programming a catastrophe. But it's not a natural catastrophe. Nature is in a continuous development, and the moving of the plates of the earth. This is a normal process. But the question is why we have to build there, at whether we have these cracks or on unstable grounds, or in cities like New Orleans, which are flooded constantly. So this is, I think, the thing which we should consider.
Thank you very much. Well, we're at the end of this dialogue. It has been really interesting and very rich, with so many elements to think about. So I thank you both, Dr. Neumann and Dr. Krieger, for participating in this dialogue, and also Alberto Fonserrada, who is also here with us, and everyone who's been watching. Thank you very much.